Officer Brad Keller stood by his cruiser, eyes scanning the park. The call had come in as a disturbance, vague, but enough to trigger the familiar sense of frustration that had been growing in him over the years. Lately, it seemed like every time he was sent to this particular park, something wasn't right. Too many kids, too much noise. The place felt more chaotic every time he visited, and it bothered him in ways he couldn't, or wouldn't, admit. He spotted them near the swings, a small group of children, most of them black, running around and laughing. His eyes zeroed in on one girl in the center of the group. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, but she seemed to be leading the others, her braids flying behind her as she chased a ball. The sight triggered something in Keller, an instinct, or maybe a bias, that shaped his every reaction before he had time to think. Without hesitation, Keller moved toward the group, his steps deliberate, his jaw set. His hand hovered near his belt before moving forward. Do not forget to subscribe, now coming back, fingers brushing the handle of his taser. He scanned the scene quickly, convinced that trouble was lurking somewhere beneath the surface. The other kids slowed when they noticed him, their play halting under the weight of his presence. But the little girl in the center didn't seem to notice, at least not immediately. She kept running, completely unaware of the shift in atmosphere. Keller's irritation flared as he neared. It wasn't just the noise, or the fact that she kept playing even after spotting him. It was something deeper, an unspoken defiance he thought he saw in her. She finally stopped and turned toward him, holding the ball tightly against her chest. He could see the confusion on her face, the innocence that he, in his agitation, failed to acknowledge. Without much thought, Keller made the decision. His mind was set before the girl even had a chance to explain herself, or before anyone could. She was involved in the disturbance. That was all he needed to know. He moved closer, towering over her as she stood there, frozen. The onlookers in the park started to gather, some recording the scene on their phones, but Keller paid no attention to them. His focus remained solely on the small girl in front of him. He acted swiftly. The handcuffs came out, snapping around the girl's wrists with practiced ease. She stiffened, her body going rigid as the cold metal tightened against her skin. She began to cry, the tears coming fast, but Keller remained detached, his actions mechanical. He had done this 100 times before. Another arrest, another incident to deal with. To him, this was just another day on the job, even though something about the scene nagged at the edges of his mind. But he pushed it away, focused only on the next steps he would need to take. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder before moving forward. Do not forget to subscribe, now coming back. The bystanders clearly shocked by what they were witnessing, but Keller remained unmoved. His hands stayed steady as he finished securing the girl, pulling her along as she stumbled, her small form overwhelmed by the situation. To him, it was done. Another case closed, another disruption handled. The girl's sobs continued, but Keller blocked it out, already mentally moving on to the paperwork waiting for him back at the station. Back at the station, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in, though Keller would never admit it to himself. The routine had taken over, processing the arrest, filling out the necessary forms, filing the report. He went through the motions, each step as familiar as the last, his mind deliberately avoiding any reflection on the small, trembling girl sitting in the holding area. Amaya Lewis. He had learned her name only after he brought her in, her small voice barely audible as she repeated it through tears. It was just another name to him, one of countless others that had passed through his hands during his years on the force. But there was something about this arrest, something that lingered. Keller tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the stern tone he had adopted, the way he had followed procedure to the letter. Everything had been by the book. He had done nothing wrong, but the video. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe, now coming back. He knew by now that someone must have filmed it. The growing crowd at the park, the murmur of voices, the phones that had appeared, all signs of how quickly things could spiral in today's world. Videos had a way of twisting events, making things seem worse than they were. He brushed it off. It wasn't the first time he'd been recorded in action, and it wouldn't be the last. His job was to maintain order, and sometimes that meant making tough decisions. There was no need to second-guess himself, yet the nagging unease wouldn't leave him. Amaya sat across the room, small and hunched, her wrists still red from the cuffs. She didn't belong there, that much was clear. Keller kept his eyes on the paperwork, pretending not to notice, but every now and then, a flicker of doubt seeped in. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another arrest. It felt wrong, but he pushed it down, unwilling to confront the thought head-on. The door to the station swung open, and in walked Captain Cassandra Lewis, her expression unreadable, but her presence unmistakable. Keller didn't need to be told who she was. He had heard about her. Everyone in the department had. Captain Lewis was well-respected, tough, and fiercely protective of her team. But none of that prepared him for the reality of seeing her in person, and certainly not in the context of what he had just done. Keller felt the air shift as soon as Captain Lewis entered the room. His back straightened instinctively, a defensive reflex taking over as her gaze swept the room, finally landing on him. She didn't say a word at first, but the look in her eyes said enough. Cold, controlled, focused. Her attention drifted to the holding area, where her daughter sat, and Keller saw the brief flicker of pain cross her face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the hardened exterior she had no doubt perfected over years in the department. But Keller had seen it. He knew exactly what was coming. Without a word, Captain Lewis walked over to the cell. Amaya looked up, her tear-streaked face lighting up the moment she saw her mother. Keller felt a tightening in his chest, but he kept his face neutral, hands busy with papers that no longer mattered. He was in trouble. He knew it now. And this wasn't just departmental trouble. It was something far worse. Captain Cassandra Lewis had seen many things during her years on the force. She had navigated the complexities of policing in a town simmering with racial tension, balancing the thin line between authority and understanding. But nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her own daughter, Amaya, sitting in a holding cell, wrists red and swollen from cuffs meant for criminals. The cold, fluorescent lights above only made the scene more surreal. As she approached the holding cell, her face remained impassive, every ounce of pain, fury, and disbelief buried deep beneath her professional exterior. Amaya looked up, her tear-streaked face glowing with a flicker of relief when she saw her mother. The little girl's lips trembled as she opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her tiny hands gripped the edges of her seat, as though bracing herself for something worse. Cassandra knelt in front of the cell, her voice soft but steady as she spoke to Amaya, her words soothing her in ways only a mother's could. Keller could hear fragments of their conversation, but the words were lost on him. He was too far gone, already spiraling into a storm of self-doubt, guilt, and dread. This was his captain's child. He had arrested her without thinking, without so much as a second glance at the facts. And now, with Captain Lewis standing before him, it felt like the weight of his career was crushing his chest. Before we continue further into this story, do not forget to subscribe. Now, coming back to where we left off. Keller had never felt so exposed. He shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes fixed on the paperwork in front of him as though completing it would somehow erase the reality of the situation. But there was no escaping this. He could feel Captain Lewis's presence, sharp and cutting like a blade in the room, even though she hadn't said a word to him yet. She finished speaking with Amaya and slowly stood up, turning toward him. Her gaze was steady, unblinking. She walked across the room with measured steps, each one landing heavily in Keller's ears. It felt like an eternity before she reached him, standing just a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. Keller cleared his throat, unsure of how to break the silence, but Captain Lewis spoke first. "Officer Keller," she said, her voice calm but laced with something cold. "What happened here?" Keller froze for a second, the question hanging in the air like a trap. He had prepared himself for this, or at least he thought he had. But now that she was standing in front of him, her daughter's cries still echoing in the background, his carefully crafted narrative unraveled. He glanced down at the report he had hastily filled out, the official explanation scribbled across the page, words that made the arrest sound routine, justified. But the weight of her stare pressed down on him, and suddenly the report felt like a flimsy defense. "Well, ma'am," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I received a call about a disturbance in the park. A group of children. I acted according to protocol. Captain Lewis didn't let him finish. She uncrossed her arms and took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "Protocol? You think what you did to my daughter was protocol?" Keller felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his composure under the weight of her accusation. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't known who the child was, that he had just been doing his job. But every excuse sounded hollow, and the truth gnawed at him in ways he couldn't ignore. This wasn't about procedure. This was about something deeper, something uglier, something he hadn't wanted to face until now. Captain Lewis didn't give him a chance to respond. "Do you even understand what you've done?" she asked, her voice dropping lower. "Do you realize what it means to handcuff a 6-year-old girl in front of a crowd of people? To treat her like a criminal because of what? Because she was black? Because she was playing too loudly in a park?" Keller's face burned with shame. The words hit him harder than he expected, each one cutting into the carefully constructed walls he had built around his actions. He had spent years telling himself that he was fair, that he didn't see race, that he acted based on the situation, not skin color. But standing there, under the relentless scrutiny of his captain, it was impossible to ignore the truth. He had seen Amaya differently from the moment he arrived at the park. He had assumed she was trouble before he even reached her, assumed the worst because of her skin, because of his own ingrained biases. For a moment, Keller considered apologizing, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say to fix this? His eyes drifted toward the door, where more officers had gathered, whispering amongst themselves. The viral video of the arrest had already begun to circulate online, and the tension within the station was palpable. Keller knew that the consequences of his actions were far from over. Before we move forward, be sure to subscribe to keep up with the twists and turns of this story, where justice, accountability, and power collide. Now, coming back to the unfolding scene, Captain Lewis wasn't finished. She turned away from Keller, her back straight, her anger barely contained. "I'm taking Amaya home," she said, her voice sharp with finality. "And after that, I'm coming back here. We'll have a very long conversation about what happens next." With those words, she walked toward the holding area, unlocking the door with the same authority she brought to every situation. Amaya leaped into her arms, and Cassandra hugged her daughter tightly, whispering reassurances that Keller couldn't hear. Then, without another glance at him, she carried Amaya out of the station, leaving behind a silence that felt suffocating. Keller stood motionless, staring at the door long after they had gone. His career, his reputation, everything he had built over the years. It was all unraveling. And deep down, he knew it wasn't just about this one arrest. It was about everything that had led him to this moment. The unchecked biases, the small injustices he had ignored, the blind loyalty to a system that had always been flawed. The door of the station closed behind Captain Lewis and her daughter, leaving Officer Keller standing alone in the silence. The faint hum of the station's equipment was the only sound that broke through the thick air, but even that felt distant. Keller's mind raced, replaying the events at the park in fragments, each detail more damning than the last. His chest tightened as reality set in. This was more than just a bad decision. This was his undoing. He walked back to his desk, his steps slow, each one heavier than the last. His hands hovered over the report he had written, eyes scanning the cold, sterile language he had used to describe the arrest. Disturbance. Suspect was non-compliant. Appropriate measures taken. He had written the report the way he always did. Methodical, detached, and official. But now, staring at the words, they seemed meaningless. There was no way to explain away the raw truth captured in the video that was now spreading like wildfire online. Before moving forward, don't forget to subscribe to follow the unfolding events of Keller's reckoning and the town's push for change. Now, back to the story. It didn't take long for the news to spread. By the time Keller had finished his shift, the local media had already picked up on the story. The video of Amaya's arrest, of a white officer handcuffing a crying, defenseless black child, was everywhere. News anchors were discussing it, headlines were sensationalizing it, and the public reaction was swift. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags demanding justice for Amaya and calling for Keller's resignation were trending. Protests were already being organized outside the station, and the conversation about racial injustice within law enforcement had reignited, more furious than ever. Keller watched it all unfold from a distance, the sinking feeling in his gut growing with each passing minute. He turned on the TV in the break room, flipping through channels until he found a report, already broadcasting the video. He sat down heavily, his face pale as he saw his own image plastered across the screen. The footage was clear. There he was, handcuffing Amaya, his face stern and unyielding, while the little girl sobbed helplessly in the background. The voices of outraged commentators layered over the scene, dissecting every second, condemning his actions with righteous fury. This wasn't the first time Keller had faced scrutiny for his conduct. He had weathered complaints before, even a few internal investigations. But this was different. This was Captain Lewis's daughter, and Keller knew, deep down, that there would be no protecting him this time. The department wouldn't shield him from the fallout, not with the entire country watching. That evening, as the sun set over the town, the protest began to swell outside the station. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds gathered, holding signs demanding accountability. Justice for Amaya. End police brutality. No more racist cops. The chants grew louder as more people joined, filling the street. The tension in the air was palpable, the community finally pushed to the edge by an act that symbolized so much of what had been wrong for years. Keller watched from a window on the second floor of the station, the flickering lights of the protesters' signs illuminating the street below. He had never seen the town like this. It felt as if every grievance, every unspoken wound, had been brought to the surface by his arrest of that little girl. And now the people were making their voices heard. Inside the station, things were no better. Keller could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him, some glaring with open disdain, others with pity. The department was divided. Some of the older officers, those who had been on the force as long as Keller, sympathized with him, seeing the arrest as an unfortunate misstep blown out of proportion by the media. But the younger officers, the ones who had grown up in a different world, more attuned to the shifting conversations about race and justice, they weren't so forgiving. Captain Lewis returned later that night, her face set in a mask of professionalism, but there was no mistaking the storm brewing behind her eyes. She walked straight to the chief's office, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. Keller didn't need to be told what was happening. He knew the conversation that was about to unfold behind that closed door. It wasn't just about him. It was about the department, the systemic failures, and the racism that had long festered within the institution. He sat at his desk, staring at the blank screen of his computer, waiting for the inevitable. His phone buzzed on the desk, but he ignored it, knowing it was likely more notifications about the protests or messages from people who had seen the video. His thoughts kept circling back to the park, to the moment he decided to put those cuffs on Amaya. He had convinced himself at the time that it was the right thing to do, but now, sitting in the silence of the station, he couldn't help but wonder if it was his own biases that had blinded him. Before we delve deeper into the confrontation and the decisions, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's continue. Hours passed, and the station grew quieter as the night shift took over. Keller's shift had long ended, but he hadn't left. He couldn't. He felt trapped, unable to face the reality waiting for him outside those walls. The protests were still going strong, and Keller knew that his presence out there would only make things worse. Finally, the door to the chief's office opened. Captain Lewis emerged, her face unreadable. She glanced at Keller for a brief moment before turning away. But in that brief moment, he saw the look in her eyes. It wasn't just anger, it was something deeper, something personal. This wasn't just a professional issue for her. This was about her daughter, about the years of navigating a system that had always treated her differently because of her race and gender, and about the personal betrayal she felt knowing that someone on her own force had done this to her family. Keller knew what was coming. He could feel it in the air, the weight of impending consequences pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. The system that had once protected him, that had allowed him to operate with impunity, was finally turning against him. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he could escape the consequences of his actions. The air in the station was thick with tension, each second that ticked by pulling Officer Keller deeper into his own spiral of regret. He stared blankly at the wall, barely registering the movements of the officers around him. Whispers floated through the halls, about the protests, about Keller himself. The world outside was demanding justice, and the shield of the badge no longer felt as impenetrable as it once had. Captain Lewis had retreated into a back office, where she remained with the chief and the city's legal team, undoubtedly preparing the department's response. Her presence just a few walls away gnawed at him. She had always been known for her fierce integrity and her unrelenting demand for accountability. But now the stakes were personal. Keller knew he was at the center of it all. The conversation in that office was about him, about what he represented, and about what would come next for the department that was unraveling before his eyes. Before we move further, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's continue. Outside, the crowd continued to swell, the hum of voices and the rhythmic pulse of chants seeping into the walls of the station. No justice, no peace, they called, their voices growing louder with each passing hour. Keller knew their anger wasn't just about him. He had ignited the flame, but the fire was fueled by years of frustration, years of injustice that had simmered beneath the surface of this small southern town. The headlines were relentless. The arrest of Amaya Lewis, a 6-year-old black girl, had touched a nerve that went far beyond the local community. Major news outlets were covering it, and the video continued to go viral, reaching millions of people across the country. Each time Keller scrolled through his phone, there were new messages, new updates, new waves of outrage and condemnation. His name was everywhere, but not in the way he had once hoped. He had spent years building a reputation on the force, but in a matter of minutes, that reputation had been torn apart. The hours dragged on, the protests outside showing no signs of slowing. More people arrived, swelling the crowd, and Keller could see their signs through the window. Protect our children. End racial profiling. Hold him accountable. The faces in the crowd were filled with anger and pain, but also with determination. This was more than just a protest, it was a reckoning. As the weight of the situation pressed down on him, Keller found himself thinking back to his first years on the force. He had joined with a sense of purpose, believing he could make a difference. But somewhere along the way, that purpose had twisted. He had become another cog in the machine, enforcing rules without question, seeing people through the narrow lens of suspicion rather than empathy. And now, with the full force of public outrage bearing down on him, he was finally being forced to confront the truth about himself. The truth was that Amaya's arrest wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake of protocol or a misunderstanding of the situation. It was a result of years of internalized prejudice, years of seeing black children and black families as problems to be managed rather than people to be protected. Keller had always told himself that he didn't see race, that he was just doing his job. But now, under the harsh glare of national scrutiny, those lies were crumbling. The door to the back office opened, and Captain Lewis stepped out, followed by the chief. She moved with purpose, her expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. Keller didn't need to hear the words to know what was coming. He could see it in the way the other officers avoided his gaze, in the way the protests outside seemed to crescendo at that exact moment, as though the world itself had aligned against him. Captain Lewis walked straight toward Keller, her face a mask of steely professionalism. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Keller saw something in her gaze that he couldn't quite define. Was it anger? Disappointment? Pity? It didn't matter. Whatever it was, he knew there would be no escaping the consequences of his actions. She stopped in front of him, her voice calm but unyielding. "Officer Keller," she said, her words heavy with authority. "You are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." Keller's stomach dropped, even though he had expected it. Administrative leave was only the beginning. He knew the process, the investigations, the hearings, the potential charges. This was the start of what would likely be the end of his career. Without a word, Keller stood up, his body feeling heavy and numb. He moved through the station like a ghost, gathering his things and preparing to leave the building that had been his second home for so many years. As he walked out the door, the sound of the protest hit him like a wave. The chants were louder now, the anger palpable. "Justice for Amaya," they cried, their voices ringing in his ears as he stepped into the night. Keller felt the eyes of the crowd on him, though they didn't know it was him. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself and walked away from the station, blending into the shadows as the weight of everything came crashing down. The life he had known, the identity he had built as a police officer, it all felt like it was slipping away, piece by piece. He didn't know what would happen next. Would he be charged? Would the department cut him loose, leaving him to face the full force of the law on his own? Or would the system, as it so often had, find a way to protect him, to sweep this incident under the rug? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but for the first time in his life, Keller wasn't sure he wanted to be protected. As Keller disappeared into the night, the protest outside the station raged on. Inside, Captain Lewis stood alone, staring out at the crowd. She had fought for years to rise through the ranks, to make a place for herself in a system that had never fully accepted her. And now, standing at the center of a storm that had engulfed her family, she knew that this fight was far from over. Amaya's arrest had become a flashpoint, a catalyst for conversations that the town and the nation had avoided for far too long. Captain Lewis was ready to lead those conversations, but she also knew that the cost would be high. The system didn't change easily, and the people who challenged it often paid a steep price. But as she watched the protesters chant her daughter's name, Captain Lewis felt something else, a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Maybe this time, real change was possible. As the night wore on, Captain Lewis remained in the station, her eyes glued to the window, where the sea of protesters refused to disperse. The chants, the signs, the solidarity, they all represented something bigger than just her daughter's wrongful arrest. It was a symbol of the long-standing tension in their community, and now it was impossible to ignore. This moment wasn't just about Amaya. It was about every child who had been treated unjustly, every black family who had lived in fear of the badge meant to protect them. Captain Lewis felt a deep, aching fatigue settle over her. She had spent years walking a tightrope, balancing her duties as an officer with the reality of being a black woman in a predominantly white institution. She had worked her way to the top, earned respect through grit and persistence. But there were still moments like this, when the weight of it all seemed unbearable. Now that weight had extended to her daughter, a child who had only been trying to play in the park. The following days were a blur of meetings, media attention, and difficult conversations. The protests continued, growing larger with each passing day. They were no longer confined to the small town. They had spread across the state and even garnered national attention. People were marching in cities far from their quiet southern town, demanding reform and calling for Keller's arrest. Inside the station, it was a different battle altogether. The police department was struggling to maintain its credibility amidst the public outcry. Captain Lewis had refused to stay silent. Her position, while difficult, gave her a platform, and she wasn't going to waste it. She stood in front of the cameras, addressing the press with the same unflinching authority that had earned her respect within the department. But this time, her message was clear. The system needed to change. She acknowledged the systemic racism within the force, something that had been festering for decades. She pointed to her own experiences, how even as captain, she had faced challenges her white colleagues never had to endure. But it wasn't just about her. She made it about the community, about the people who had been marginalized for generations. The camera lights flashed as her words cut through the air with precision and passion. This isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture that allows officers to act without accountability, where bias and racism go unchecked. We need change, not just in our town, but across the nation. We owe it to our children, we owe it to Amaya. Her speech went viral. News networks ran it on a loop, and for the first time, Captain Lewis found herself at the center of a national conversation about race and policing. She didn't ask for this role, but now that it had been thrust upon her, she embraced it fully. Back at home, Amaya remained unaware of the storm raging around her. Captain Lewis had shielded her from the chaos, keeping her away from the TV and the endless stream of news reports. But she couldn't shield her forever. Amaya's innocent questions about why she couldn't play at the park anymore, or why people were standing outside their house with cameras, tore at Captain Lewis's heart. The city's leadership had no choice but to act. A formal investigation into Officer Keller was launched. And for once, it wasn't just an internal review. An independent watchdog group was brought in to oversee the process. Keller's fellow officers were forced to reckon with the fact that one of their own had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. For many, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was a betrayal, an attack on the blue line they had sworn to protect. Meanwhile, Keller himself became a recluse. He stopped showing up to meetings. His house became a fortress where reporters and angry locals gathered outside, demanding answers. His phone rang nonstop with messages from lawyers, colleagues, and his superiors, but he ignored them all. The few times he ventured out, he was met with glares and whispers, a stark contrast to the quiet respect he once enjoyed in the community. The same people who used to greet him warmly now crossed the street to avoid him. But there was no escaping what he had done. He watched as the video replayed over and over on the news, each time a reminder of the irreversible damage he had caused. Keller had thought he could handle the storm. After all, hadn't he seen others get away with similar incidents before? But this time things were different. Amaya was not just any child, and Captain Lewis was not just any officer. Before we delve further into Keller's crumbling world and the investigation, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's continue. The investigation was swift, thorough, and transparent, something that had rarely happened in cases like this before. With the public demanding accountability, there was no room for backdoor deals or sweeping things under the rug. Keller was suspended without pay, and criminal charges were on the horizon. The city was preparing for what would likely be a long and contentious legal battle, with civil rights groups already lining up to take on the case. For Keller, the realization came slowly but surely. There would be no escape. He had thought his years on the force would protect him, that his loyalty to the badge would earn him some form of leniency. But the winds were changing. The department was no longer in a position to protect its own at the expense of justice. Too many eyes were on them now. As the investigation moved forward, Keller's past was dredged up. Old complaints, once dismissed as minor infractions, were suddenly under a microscope. Patterns of behavior emerged: excessive force, racially biased stops, reports of misconduct that had been quietly pushed aside over the years. Keller had never faced real consequences for any of it, and now it was all coming back to haunt him. Each new revelation was another blow, and Keller felt his world collapse bit by bit. The support he had once counted on evaporated. His fellow officers, even those who had sympathized with him at first, began to distance themselves. The department, now in full damage control mode, treated him like a pariah. Meanwhile, Captain Lewis stood firm. She refused to let this moment pass without forcing real change. In meetings with city officials, in interviews with national news outlets, she pushed for reforms: body cameras, civilian oversight, stricter use of force policies, and mandatory bias training. She knew that these reforms alone wouldn't fix the deep-rooted problems in law enforcement, but they were a start. And as the days passed, it became clear that Amaya's arrest was the tipping point. Protests turned into organized movements, demanding not only Keller's accountability, but systemic change at every level. This wasn't just a momentary outcry, it was a movement. As the protests morphed into organized action, the town's streets became a constant gathering point for people seeking change. What had begun as a reaction to Keller's actions had turned into something far bigger, a reckoning for a community that had been simmering with unspoken tensions for decades. Marches were coordinated, petitions circulated, and rallies held in the park where Amaya had once been playing. The park itself had become a symbol of resistance and hope, with crowds spilling over its boundaries every evening, demanding justice not just for Amaya, but for every marginalized person who had been wronged. Captain Lewis found herself at the center of this whirlwind. She balanced her responsibilities within the department while becoming a reluctant figurehead for the movement outside of it. Her dual role, both as a mother whose child had been victimized and as the head of the very system that had allowed the victimization to happen, placed her in a unique and deeply complex position. The investigation into Keller's actions became a focal point for the town's simmering unrest. The watchdog group poured through every detail of his arrest of Amaya, every angle of the viral video, every police report he had ever filed, and every complaint that had been buried over the years. What they uncovered painted a damning portrait of a man whose biases had guided his actions for years, unchecked by the department that was supposed to hold him accountable. Yet Keller wasn't alone in his culpability. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that Keller's behavior was a symptom of a larger disease within the department. His superiors had overlooked complaints, dismissed concerns from the community, and enabled officers like Keller to act with impunity. This revelation only stoked the fires of protest even more, with many calling for a complete overhaul of the police department. The protests were no longer just about Keller. They were about the systemic failures of the police force, the broader justice system, and the town itself. Signs went up demanding the resignation of the police chief, more accountability measures, and justice for victims of police brutality. The protests also brought out counter-protesters, many of whom saw the movement as an attack on law enforcement itself. Tensions flared, and the once peaceful town found itself teetering on the brink of chaos. Inside her office, Captain Lewis worked late into the nights, poring over old case files and reviewing policies she had never had the time, or perhaps the nerve, to challenge before. She could feel the tension mounting within her own department. Officers who had once been her allies now looked at her with suspicion, some even with outright hostility. They saw her public condemnation of Keller as a betrayal, an abandonment of the fraternity they all belonged to. But Captain Lewis knew there was no other way. She had to stand firm, not only for her daughter, but for every black mother and child who had lived under the threat of unchecked authority. The very integrity of her leadership and her conscience depended on it. Yet, even as she moved forward with calls for reform, there was no denying the strain it put on her. Lewis had always been proud of her ability to separate her personal life from her professional one. She had navigated a career filled with glass ceilings and systemic racism, rising to her current position despite the odds. But now, her personal and professional lives had collided in the most painful way imaginable. Back at home, she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Amaya, who still didn't fully understand the gravity of what had happened. The little girl was aware that something was wrong, that her mother was spending long hours at work, and that people were talking about her arrest, but she couldn't grasp the full extent of the firestorm it had caused. Lewis tried to shield her daughter from the worst of it, but there were moments late at night when she couldn't hold back her tears. As the town became a national focal point for the debate on police reform, Keller's future became even more precarious. He had initially hoped that his fellow officers would rally around him, that the department would close ranks and protect one of their own. But this time, the public scrutiny was too intense. The department couldn't afford to shield him, and even the police union, known for its staunch defense of officers in trouble, was hesitant to take up his case. In his isolation, Keller began to reflect on his actions in a way he hadn't before. For years, he had been operating on autopilot, following the same patterns, the same assumptions, without ever questioning them. He had prided himself on being a good cop, a man who kept his community safe. But what did that mean when he had targeted a 6-year-old girl, whose only crime was playing in a park? The videos played in his head on a loop, the look of fear on Amaya's face, the gasps of the onlookers, and most damning of all, the moment he slapped the handcuffs on her tiny wrists. He had replayed those few minutes countless times, each time trying to justify his actions, each time failing to do so. Keller's own reckoning was just beginning. As he sat in his home, surrounded by silence, he realized the enormity of what he had done. But realizing it was only the first step, what came next would be harder, facing the consequences of his actions, not just in the legal sense, but on a deeper, more personal level. Meanwhile, the media attention showed no signs of waning. News trucks camped outside his house, and reporters hounded his neighbors for comments. Keller's name was now synonymous with everything wrong with policing in America, a symbol of the racial injustices that had plagued the country for generations. He had become a villain in a story much bigger than himself. The town was changing, and so was the country. What had started as a local incident had sparked a broader conversation about race, power, and the role of police in society. This wasn't the first time such a conversation had emerged, but it felt different this time. Louder, more insistent. And at the center of it all was the arrest of a little girl and the fractured system that had allowed it to happen. As the town braced for the next chapter in this unfolding drama, Keller knew that his role in it was far from over. He would have to face the consequences of his actions, not just in the court of law, but in the court of public opinion, and perhaps most importantly, in his own conscience. Captain Lewis, too, knew that the hardest battles lay ahead. The movement she had become a part of wasn't just about changing a few policies or holding one man accountable. It was about transforming an entire system, and that kind of change didn't happen overnight. But as she looked at her daughter, safe at home, she knew that the fight was worth it. The badge she wore was heavy, but so was the responsibility it came with. And this time, she wouldn't be alone in carrying that weight. As the days wore on, the town found itself at the epicenter of a nationwide movement, the chants of "Justice for Amaya" were echoed in cities far beyond the borders of the small southern town where the incident had occurred. Protesters, many of whom had never even set foot in the town, now stood in solidarity with the locals, demanding a shift in the power dynamics that had allowed such an incident to happen in the first place. The park where Amaya had been arrested had become a makeshift memorial, a gathering spot for those who sought not only justice for Amaya, but a broader reckoning with the system itself. Captain Lewis continued to navigate the complexity of her dual roles. The pressure was immense. On one side, she was being hailed as a hero for taking a stand against the entrenched racism within the force. On the other side, she faced intense scrutiny and even hostility from some within the department, including those who had once called her friend. The quiet murmurs in the station had grown louder. Lewis, they said, was jeopardizing the brotherhood of the force. She was setting a dangerous precedent by not protecting one of their own, and that made her a traitor in their eyes. Lewis knew these whispers all too well. They came from the same place that had resisted her promotion to captain in the first place. But this time, she couldn't afford to listen to them. The stakes were too high. She had made a decision that transcended her personal struggles. This was about her daughter, her community, and a much larger fight. Every day, as she sat in her office or stood before a camera, Lewis braced herself against the weight of the task at hand. Inside the police department, the tension was palpable. Officers who had once shared jokes with Captain Lewis in the break room now avoided her gaze, their conversations halting whenever she walked into a room. The old guard of the department, the ones who had been there since before Lewis had risen through the ranks, regarded her with thinly veiled disdain. To them, she was dismantling the very foundation of what they believed policing to be. They resented her public stance, but they were even more threatened by the fact that the public seemed to be rallying behind her. The investigation into Officer Keller continued to make headlines. Every day, new details emerged, painting a fuller picture of Keller's career and the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate with such impunity. The watchdog group released findings that highlighted a pattern of racially biased policing in Keller's arrest record, minor infractions disproportionately targeted at black citizens, reports of misconduct swept under the rug, and complaints that had been resolved internally without consequence. It was clear that Keller's actions on the day of Amaya's arrest were not an isolated incident. They were part of a much larger problem. This new information only added fuel to the fire. The protesters outside the department were no longer content with Keller's suspension. They demanded that he be charged with a crime, that the department undergo a full overhaul, and that Captain Lewis be given the authority to implement the reforms she had been calling for. The pressure mounted daily, and the once quiet southern town became a focal point for national discussions about race and policing. News networks sent correspondents to cover the protests, and every statement from the city's leadership was dissected and analyzed. Amidst all of this, Captain Lewis maintained her composure. She knew that her every move was being scrutinized, not just by the public, but by those within her own ranks. Each decision she made felt like walking a tightrope between doing what was right and maintaining the precarious balance of power within the department. But for her, there was no turning back. The arrest of her daughter had been the final straw. Now she was fully committed to seeing this through. Meanwhile, Keller's world continued to collapse around him. His once quiet home had become a battleground, with protesters gathered outside, shouting for him to be held accountable. Keller had become a ghost in his own town, his every move watched, his every word dissected. The people who had once been his neighbors now viewed him as the embodiment of everything wrong with the justice system. At first, Keller had tried to maintain his defiance. He still believed, deep down, that he had done nothing wrong, that his actions on the day of Amaya's arrest were justified. But as the evidence mounted, as old reports of his misconduct resurfaced, and as the community turned against him, that confidence began to erode. The isolation became suffocating, and Keller found himself retreating further into his own mind, questioning everything he had once believed to be true. For years, Keller had been taught that the badge was a symbol of authority, a tool to maintain order in a world full of chaos. But now, he could no longer ignore the fact that he had used that authority to harm an innocent child. The image of Amaya, her small hands shackled in cuffs, haunted him. He had watched the video of her arrest over and over again, and each time, the weight of his actions grew heavier. There was no escaping the truth. He had been wrong, but realizing his mistake was one thing, taking responsibility for it was another. Keller knew that he was at a crossroads. He could continue down the path of denial, hoping that the system would protect him as it had so many times before, or he could face the consequences head-on. The latter option was terrifying. It meant admitting not just to the public, but to himself, that he had been complicit in a system that was fundamentally broken. As Keller grappled with his own inner turmoil, Captain Lewis pushed forward with her calls for reform. The city's leadership, under immense pressure from the public, had no choice but to listen. They convened special meetings to discuss the future of the police department, inviting community leaders and civil rights organizations to participate in the conversations. What had once been a closed-door system of power was being forced open, and Lewis was at the forefront of it. Her demands were simple, yet profound. Accountability at every level of the department, civilian oversight, de-escalation training, and a commitment to addressing the racial biases that had long gone unchallenged within the force. She knew that real change wouldn't come overnight, but she was determined to lay the groundwork for a new kind of policing, one that served and protected all members of the community equally. The town was divided. There were those who supported Lewis wholeheartedly, grateful that someone in power was finally taking a stand against the injustices that had plagued their community for so long. But there were also those who resisted, who saw her efforts as a threat to the old order. They viewed the calls for reform as an attack on their way of life, on the authority of the police, and on the status quo that had kept them in power for generations. As the town braced for what would surely be a long and difficult fight, one thing was clear. The arrest of a 6-year-old black girl had become the spark that ignited a movement, one that would not easily be extinguished. The question now was whether the system would bend to the will of the people or remain rigid in its resistance to change. Either way, the town, and the country, would never be the same again. As the months wore on, the protests showed no signs of slowing down. What had started as a local call for justice had ballooned into a sustained movement, gaining support from all corners of the country. Civil rights organizations, activists, and even prominent figures from the entertainment world lent their voices to the cause. National media continued to shine a spotlight on the town, turning what had once been a small, insular community into a symbol of both the rot within the justice system and the possibility of change. Amaya Lewis's name became synonymous with the fight for justice. The image of her small frame, standing helpless as Keller placed handcuffs on her, was emblazoned on protest signs, murals, and social media posts across the nation. She had become a symbol of both the vulnerability of black children and the lengths to which an unjust system could go to exert its control. Captain Lewis watched as her daughter's face was plastered on TV screens and internet feeds with both pride and heartbreak. Amaya had become a rallying point for something much bigger, but she was still just a child. Protecting her from the emotional toll of being thrust into the national spotlight was a challenge Captain Lewis hadn't anticipated. She had to reconcile her role as a mother with her responsibilities as a leader of the police department, a delicate balancing act that often felt impossible. Amaya, for her part, had returned to school, surrounded by extra layers of protection. Teachers and classmates treated her with a cautious sympathy, unsure how to approach her after what had happened. Amaya was aware, in her own childlike way, that she had become famous, though she couldn't fully understand why. To her, she had only been playing in the park that day. How had it turned into all of this? Meanwhile, Officer Keller's fate was being decided behind closed doors. He had been placed on administrative leave, his badge and gun taken from him, but the investigation into his actions was still ongoing. The town's mayor and city council were locked in discussions about how to proceed. Pressure from the public to fire Keller outright was immense, but there were legal obstacles in the way: contracts, union agreements, and the ever-present threat of a lawsuit from Keller's attorneys if due process wasn't followed. Keller's lawyers argued that he had acted within his legal authority, that the arrest had been an unfortunate misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by a viral video. But this defense fell on increasingly deaf ears, as more details about Keller's past came to light. A pattern of excessive force complaints, incidents of racially motivated stops, and unsubstantiated arrests were uncovered. each one adding to the growing narrative that Keller wasn't just a bad cop, he was emblematic of a broken system. Keller himself had become a pariah in the community. His once proud reputation as a no-nonsense cop had been shredded by the revelations of his past misconduct. He found himself isolated, with few friends left in the department willing to stand by him. The public scrutiny, the protests outside his home, and the constant media attention had driven him to the brink. Even his family had distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the man the nation now saw as a villain. As he waited for the outcome of the investigation, Keller became increasingly introspective. In the quiet of his home, he was forced to confront the realities of what he had done, not just to Amaya, but to every person he had wronged throughout his career. His defenses, which had once seemed ironclad, began to crumble under the weight of his guilt. He had spent years believing that his actions were justified, that he was simply enforcing the law. But now, in the cold light of public outrage, he could no longer escape the truth. Keller's reckoning was slow and painful. Every day, he relived the moment he had cuffed Amaya, the look of fear in her eyes, the gasps of the crowd. He had told himself that he was just doing his job, but deep down he knew that wasn't true. He had acted out of prejudice, out of a belief, one so ingrained in him that he hadn't even questioned it, that black children, black people, were inherently more suspicious, more dangerous. And in doing so, he had destroyed lives, including his own. Meanwhile, Captain Lewis continued to lead the charge for reform within the police department. The protests had forced the city's leadership to take action, and changes were slowly being implemented. Civilian oversight was introduced, new de-escalation training programs were put in place, and for the first time in the department's history, an external investigation was launched into the patterns of behavior that had allowed officers like Keller to operate unchecked for so long. But these reforms were just the beginning. Captain Lewis knew that real change would take time, years, perhaps even decades. The entrenched racism within the department wouldn't be eradicated overnight. Many of her officers still resisted the reforms, viewing them as an attack on their authority, on their ability to police effectively. Lewis faced daily battles within the department, fighting not just for new policies, but for a new mindset, a shift in how her officers viewed the community they were supposed to protect. The strain on her was enormous. Every day she felt like she was walking a tightrope, trying to balance her duties as a police captain with her responsibility as a mother and a black woman. She had spent her entire career rising through the ranks, navigating a system that wasn't built for people like her. And now she found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't asked for, but one she knew she couldn't turn away from. The national attention on the case had a ripple effect. Other cities across the country began to take notice, and similar calls for police reform sprang up in towns and cities far removed from the one where Amaya's arrest had taken place. Activists used her story to highlight broader issues of systemic racism in policing, and before long, Amaya's name was being invoked at protests and town hall meetings from coast to coast. For Captain Lewis, it was both heartening and overwhelming. The weight of leading this charge, not just for her daughter, but for an entire generation of black children, was immense. She knew that the fight would be long and grueling, but there was no other choice. She had to keep pushing forward, for Amaya, for her community, and for every person who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. Meanwhile, Keller's fate was sealed. After months of deliberation, the city council, under intense public pressure, announced that Keller would be fired from the police department. The decision was met with cheers from the protesters and quiet relief from those inside the department who had grown tired of defending him. But for Keller, the consequences went far beyond the loss of his job. In the days following his termination, Keller withdrew further into himself. He was a man without a purpose, without a future. He had lost everything: his career, his standing in the community, and most importantly, his sense of self. For years, he had defined himself by his role as a police officer, by the power that came with the badge. Now, that power was gone, and Keller was left with nothing but the weight of his own guilt. As the town began to move forward, grappling with the changes that were slowly being implemented, Keller remained a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when prejudice and power collide. His story, like Amaya's, became a part of the national conversation about race, justice, and accountability. But while Amaya's story was one of hope and resilience, Keller's was one of ruin and regret. And so, the town, once quiet, now forever changed, moved into the future, carrying with it the lessons of the past. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for Captain Lewis, for Amaya, and for every person who had been touched by this story, there was no turning back. The fight for justice had only just begun. The town continued to grapple with the aftermath of the incident, navigating a landscape transformed by protests, debates, and a renewed focus on justice and accountability. The community was now divided in ways it had never been before, with some residents rallying behind Captain Lewis and her calls for reform, while others clung to the old ways, resistant to the changes that threatened their comfort. The air was thick with tension, but there was also an undeniable sense of hope, a recognition that perhaps this time, things could be different. Captain Lewis dedicated herself to the cause of reform with an intensity that was both admirable and exhausting. Each day, she met with community leaders, activists, and department representatives, trying to forge a path toward a new kind of policing. They discussed how to create a more transparent police force, one that actively engaged with the community rather than operating from a place of authority and control. Lewis emphasized the importance of community policing, an approach that focused on building relationships and trust with residents rather than treating them as potential criminals. The police department began hosting open forums, inviting residents to voice their concerns and share their experiences. The first few meetings were fraught with emotion, as community members recounted their own encounters with law enforcement, stories of fear, humiliation, and injustice. Captain Lewis listened intently, taking notes and acknowledging the pain of those who spoke. She understood that listening was a crucial first step in healing the rift between the police and the community. As weeks turned into months, the forums became a platform for dialogue and understanding. Officers were present at these meetings, and they began to see the faces behind the statistics they had always known. It was one thing to read about crime rates and community issues in a report. It was another to hear the first-hand accounts of people whose lives had been impacted. Slowly, perceptions began to shift within the department. Some officers started to realize that the community they served was not an enemy, but a partner in creating a safer environment for everyone. Despite the progress, Captain Lewis faced numerous challenges. She encountered resistance from some veteran officers who were set in their ways. They saw the changes as a threat to their authority and an infringement on their ability to do their jobs. It was an uphill battle, one that often left her feeling isolated and under siege. She often spent late nights at the office, poring over reports and drafting policies, trying to find ways to balance the needs of her officers with the demands of the community. Keller's termination had sent shockwaves through the department, but it also opened the door for new hires, officers who were eager to embrace a more community-oriented approach. Captain Lewis seized this opportunity to recruit a diverse group of individuals who reflected the community they served. She wanted officers who understood the importance of empathy, who were willing to listen, learn, and grow. With each new recruit, she felt a flicker of hope that the culture within the department could change. Simultaneously, Amaya, who had become the face of the movement, struggled with the implications of her newfound notoriety. Though her family had sought to shield her from the media frenzy, the reality was that she was now a symbol of resistance against injustice. With her image everywhere, on banners, in news articles, and across social media, Amaya felt the weight of expectation. The pressures mounted as her friends and classmates, while well-meaning, began treating her differently, as though she were somehow special or more important than them. It was both flattering and suffocating. To ease Amaya's stress, Captain Lewis sought ways to provide her with a sense of normalcy. They began to spend more time together, engaging in activities that allowed them to bond outside the chaos of their public lives. They baked cookies, went on nature walks, and watched movies together, all while reminding Amaya that she was just a child, not the face of a movement. These moments became essential, not just for Amaya's well-being, but for Captain Lewis's too, providing them both with respite from their challenges. The community continued to rally, creating spaces for healing and solidarity. Support groups formed, providing a platform for those affected by police violence to share their stories. These gatherings offered a safe space for individuals to express their fears, frustrations, and hopes. The police department, under Captain Lewis's leadership, began to participate in these discussions, showing a willingness to engage with the very people they were tasked with protecting. As the national conversation around police reform continued to evolve, the town became a case study, a model for what could be achieved when a community came together to demand change. Media outlets flocked to the town, eager to cover the transformation taking place, and Captain Lewis became a sought-after speaker at events across the country. She used her platform to highlight not only the struggles of her own community, but also the systemic issues that plagued police forces nationwide. Keller, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines, grappling with his own demons. After losing his job, he found it challenging to reintegrate into a world that had once viewed him as a respected officer. The isolation weighed heavily on him. He had lost not just his career, but also his identity, and with it, his purpose. He felt like a ghost haunting the very streets he had once patrolled with pride. In the depths of his despair, Keller sought therapy. For the first time, he was forced to confront the biases that had shaped his worldview. The process was grueling. He was challenged to reflect on his past actions, to recognize the harm he had inflicted, and to understand the broader implications of his choices. It was uncomfortable work, filled with moments of anger, shame, and guilt, but Keller knew he had to face it. If there was any hope for redemption, he had to start with the truth. As Keller attended therapy sessions, he began to unravel the tightly woven tapestry of his beliefs. He recounted the lessons he had learned during his training, lessons steeped in a culture that often prioritized aggression over understanding. He confronted the ways in which his own upbringing had colored his perceptions of race and authority. Each session was a painful reminder of the prejudice that had taken root within him, but also an opportunity to grow and change. Over time, Keller started to recognize that his actions were not merely a reflection of personal failings, but of a system that had perpetuated racial injustice for decades. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. He understood that accountability was not just about facing the consequences of his actions, it was also about taking active steps to dismantle the biases that had fueled them. Meanwhile, the town continued to evolve. Captain Lewis pushed for initiatives that would create long-lasting change. From youth engagement programs to mentorship opportunities aimed at fostering positive relationships between officers and community members. She was determined to ensure that the new generation of officers would not repeat the mistakes of the past. Each initiative was a step toward healing, a way to rebuild trust and dismantle the barriers that had historically divided the police and the community. However, not everyone was on board. The old guard within the department remained resistant, believing that Captain Lewis's efforts undermined their authority. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, with some officers questioning her leadership and commitment to their safety. They were uncomfortable with the changes, viewing them as an erosion of the standards they had lived by. It created a rift that Captain Lewis had to navigate carefully, choosing her battles wisely as she sought to bring about meaningful reform. In the heart of it all, Amaya blossomed. With her mother's guidance and support, she began to understand the importance of her story. She found her voice, participating in community events where she spoke about her experience, advocating for a future where children like her would never again be subjected to injustice. Amaya became a source of inspiration, her innocence juxtaposed against the harsh realities of the world, reminding everyone of the stakes involved. The community rallied around her, creating programs dedicated to educating children about their rights and the importance of standing up against injustice. Amaya's participation in these initiatives helped her find purpose in her own narrative, transforming her pain into a powerful catalyst for change. She became a symbol of resilience, her young face representing not just the fight for justice, but also the hope for a brighter future. As the town grappled with its past, Keller found himself increasingly drawn to Amaya's story. He watched the coverage of her speeches, her involvement in community events, and the way she had become a beacon of hope for so many. It was a bittersweet reminder of the child he had wronged, and it stirred something within him, a longing for redemption. He knew that if he was ever going to find peace, he had to confront Amaya directly. After months of contemplation, Keller made the decision to reach out to Captain Lewis. He wanted to meet, to apologize for his actions, and to understand the impact they had on her family. It was a daunting prospect, but he knew it was necessary. The gravity of his previous decisions weighed heavily on him, and the path to redemption began with acknowledging the pain he had caused. As Captain Lewis prepared for the meeting, she felt a mix of apprehension and resolve. This was not a conversation she had anticipated, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. Keller had been a symbol of everything wrong with the system, but perhaps this could be an opportunity for both of them to confront the truth and work toward healing. When the day of the meeting arrived, Keller and Captain Lewis met in a neutral location, an open community center where dialogues around reform had been taking place. The room was filled with bright colors and children's artwork, a stark contrast to the somber reality of their conversation. As they settled into their chairs, an air of tension lingered, heavy with the weight of the past. Keller began by expressing his remorse. He spoke of the countless nights he had spent reflecting on his actions, the torment of recognizing that he had treated a child, an innocent child, without the compassion and humanity that every person deserved. He recounted the details of that day in the park, his heartache growing as he relived the moment he had placed the cuffs on Amaya. The pain in his voice was palpable as he conveyed the depths of his regret. Captain Lewis listened intently, her heart a mix of sorrow and skepticism. She had spent months advocating for change, fighting against the very mindset that Keller represented. As she looked into his eyes, she saw not just a man seeking redemption, but also a reminder of the systemic issues that continued to plague her community. This was the moment of reckoning she had been preparing for, and she knew it would shape not only their futures, but also the future of the police department. When Keller finished, the silence between them felt deafening. Captain Lewis took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her emotions. She had spent countless hours thinking about this moment, envisioning how it might unfold. She had hoped for an apology, but it felt inadequate against the backdrop of the damage that had been done. While she recognized the importance of accountability and acknowledgement, she also knew that words alone would not suffice. Real change required action, and she needed to see Keller commit to that change. She spoke about the impact his actions had on her family, on Amaya, and on the community at large. She shared the fear and pain they had experienced, how the world had shifted for them since that day. Keller listened, absorbing every word, feeling the weight of her experience crash down on him like a tidal wave. For too long, he had been able to dismiss the voices of those he had harmed, but now he was confronted with the raw reality of his actions. He understood that he had become a part of a narrative that extended far beyond himself, and it was a narrative that needed to be rewritten. As they continued their conversation, an unexpected alliance began to form. Keller spoke of his desire to learn, to understand the experiences of those he had previously viewed with suspicion. He expressed a willingness to be part of the solution, to advocate for reform from within the system. Captain Lewis could sense his sincerity, and it ignited a flicker of hope within her. They discussed what it would mean for Keller to engage in community initiatives, to take an active role in shaping the future of policing. It was clear to Captain Lewis that Keller was not just seeking forgiveness. He was seeking a chance to make amends and help dismantle the biases that had governed his actions for so long. Before they concluded their meeting, Captain Lewis issued a challenge to Keller. He would need to commit to real actions, not just words. He must participate in community forums, educate himself about the systemic issues at play, and work directly with organizations advocating for change. It was a daunting task, but Keller nodded in agreement, understanding that this was the first step in his long journey toward redemption. As they parted ways, Captain Lewis felt a mix of hope and trepidation. She knew that change would take time, but the possibility of collaboration with someone who had once embodied the very system she was trying to reform felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Before we delve, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's continue. In the following weeks, Keller began attending the community forums and support groups. Each time he walked into a room filled with people who had been affected by police violence, he felt the weight of their gazes upon him. He was no longer just a police officer. He was a man confronted by the consequences of his actions. The experience was humbling, and at times excruciatingly uncomfortable. As he sat in those meetings, Keller listened to stories that pierced through his defenses. He heard parents recounting the fear they felt when their children walked out the door, the anxiety that gripped them every time they saw police lights, flash in the distance. He listened to young people who shared their own encounters with law enforcement, each narrative a reminder of the power dynamics at play and the dehumanization that often accompanied them. Gradually, Keller began to engage in conversations, asking questions and acknowledging the pain he had contributed to. There were moments of anger, tears, and even confrontations as community members grappled with their emotions. Some were unwilling to forgive him, and others were reluctant to trust him. He expected it. After all, he was the face of the very system they had fought against. But as weeks turned into months, he also began to form connections. He reached out to those who were willing to engage, asking how he could help support their initiatives. He shared his own story, recounting his struggles with the biases he had internalized. The more vulnerable he became, the more he realized the power of sharing one's truth. He was learning to listen without defensiveness, to engage without prejudice, and to understand the importance of empathy in building bridges. Captain Lewis observed this transformation from a distance, feeling a cautious sense of optimism. She had initially been skeptical of Keller's intentions, but with each passing week, she saw him genuinely striving to make amends. He participated in initiatives aimed at youth engagement, sharing his story with children in schools and community centers. He even mentored a group of young people interested in pursuing careers in law enforcement, emphasizing the importance of serving with integrity and empathy. Keller's journey toward redemption did not come without setbacks. He faced backlash from some members of the community who felt that he was trying to absolve himself too easily, as well as from officers who remained loyal to the old ways. There were whispers within the department, critiques of his change of heart, and discussions about loyalty and duty. But Keller remained undeterred, knowing that the work he was doing was essential, not just for his own redemption, but for the broader community. The partnership between Keller and Captain Lewis began to evolve into a collaborative effort for reform. They worked together on initiatives aimed at improving community police relations, incorporating feedback from community members into new training protocols and policies. Together, they addressed the pressing need for change, emphasizing the importance of accountability and transparency. The changes within the police department started to show results. The number of complaints against officers began to decline, and community trust slowly began to rebuild. People started to see officers not as adversaries, but as allies, working toward the same goals of safety and justice. It was a long way from perfect, but the transformation was palpable. Amaya, for her part, continued to thrive amid the turbulence. She became an advocate in her own right, participating in youth-led initiatives focused on social justice and equality. Inspired by her experiences, she developed a passion for storytelling, using her voice to uplift others. She found joy in writing and began sharing her thoughts through poetry and essays, expressing her hopes and dreams for a world free from prejudice and fear. Captain Lewis watched with pride as her daughter navigated the complexities of their new reality. She saw the strength in Amaya's resilience and the compassion that radiated from her. It reminded her of why they had embarked on this journey in the first place, to create a safer, more just world for the next generation. As Keller and Captain Lewis continued their work, they organized a community event, a gathering that would bring together residents, police officers, and activists to celebrate the progress made and to acknowledge the work still ahead. It was an opportunity for healing, for connection, and for unity, a chance to reaffirm their commitment to a future where justice prevailed. As the day approached, excitement and apprehension filled the air. The community center, adorned with colorful banners and artwork created by local youth, became a symbol of hope. Amaya helped organize activities for children, ensuring that they would have a space to express themselves and engage in meaningful conversations. She understood that this was not just about her own journey, but about creating a brighter future for everyone. On the day of the event, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. Residents from all walks of life gathered, sharing laughter, stories, and ideas. Keller and Captain Lewis took to the stage, addressing the crowd with a shared vision for change. Their partnership had become a testament to what was possible when individuals were willing to confront their pasts and work toward a common goal. As they spoke, Amaya stood nearby, a quiet yet powerful presence. She felt a sense of pride swell within her, knowing that her story had sparked this change. The smiles on the faces of her neighbors, the camaraderie among the officers and community members, it all represented a shift toward a more hopeful future. The event unfolded beautifully, with laughter and joy resonating throughout the community center. Children ran around, engaging in art projects, while adults shared their stories and visions for a more equitable future. Keller and Captain Lewis walked through the crowd, engaging in conversations, shaking hands, and listening to the hopes of their community members. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the gathering, Captain Lewis took the stage again to introduce Amaya. The crowd fell silent, a palpable sense of anticipation filling the air. Amaya stepped forward, a small figure with a powerful presence. She looked out at the crowd, her heart racing, and began to speak. Amaya shared her story. The moment her life had changed, the fear she had felt when she was arrested, and the love and support of her family and community. She spoke with a clarity that belied her age, weaving together threads of pain and hope. Her voice, filled with sincerity, resonated deeply with those in attendance, reminding them of the stakes involved in the fight for justice. As she concluded her speech, the crowd erupted in applause, a resounding affirmation of her courage. Tears glistened in the eyes of many as they recognized the strength of this young girl who had become a symbol of resilience. Amaya's words echoed in the hearts of those gathered, igniting a renewed sense of purpose in their collective mission for change. The evening continued with music, food, and community bonding, and as the sun set, the stars began to twinkle above. For the first time in a long while, the town felt alive with possibility. People exchanged numbers, made plans for future collaborations, and committed to continuing the work that had only just begun. In the weeks that followed the community event, a palpable shift took place within the town. The spirit of collaboration and unity fostered by that day catalyzed a series of initiatives aimed at continuing the dialogue around reform. Keller, under Captain Lewis's guidance, worked alongside community members to create programs designed to enhance trust and accountability. They established regular community police dialogues, forums that allowed residents to voice their concerns and propose solutions directly to law enforcement. The events were designed to break down barriers, to transform the narrative surrounding policing in the town. Officers who once operated from a position of authority now stood side by side with residents, willing to listen and learn. As these initiatives gained momentum, Keller felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long. The connections he formed with community members deepened, and he began to understand the importance of empathy and collaboration. He was no longer just a police officer, he was a part of a community, striving for a better future. Captain Lewis continued to champion reform from within the department, advocating for changes in training and recruitment practices. She implemented workshops focused on implicit bias, ensuring that officers were equipped with the tools necessary to engage with the community thoughtfully and respectfully. Her efforts were supported by the community, who recognized the significance of these changes. Amaya, too, became more involved in the ongoing initiatives. Inspired by her experience, she began organizing youth-led discussions focused on social justice, where her peers could express their thoughts and concerns. These gatherings allowed young people to explore the challenges they faced in their communities and to brainstorm solutions together. Amaya's leadership flourished, and she became a role model for her friends, encouraging them to engage in activism and advocacy. As the community thrived, Keller found himself reflecting on his own journey of growth. He engaged in difficult conversations, confronting the biases he had held for so long. He learned to recognize the humanity in everyone he encountered, to see beyond the badge and uniform. Each interaction became an opportunity for growth and understanding, reinforcing his commitment to the work he was doing. Meanwhile, tensions within the police department remained, particularly among some veteran officers who felt threatened by the changes occurring under Captain Lewis's leadership. They began to voice their frustrations openly, questioning the need for reform and resisting the efforts being implemented. This internal conflict created an environment of uncertainty, one that Captain Lewis had to navigate carefully. In response to the resistance, Captain Lewis organized team-building exercises, aiming to bridge the gap between the old guard and the new vision for policing. These exercises emphasized communication, collaboration, and mutual respect. While progress was slow, she remained resolute, believing that change was possible if everyone could be brought to the table. The community continued to rally behind Captain Lewis, supporting her efforts to transform the police department. They attended city council meetings, advocating for the allocation of resources to support reform initiatives. The energy surrounding these efforts was contagious, inspiring others to engage and speak up for the changes they wanted to see. Remember to subscribe. Now, let's continue. As the months passed, the collaboration between the police department and the community deepened, yet challenges remained. The old guard within the department continued to voice their dissent, resistant to the changes that were taking root. Captain Lewis faced opposition from some officers who were vocal about their discontent, questioning the new training programs and the emphasis on community engagement. Keller, caught in the middle, struggled with his loyalties. He understood the need for reform, but he also felt the weight of camaraderie with his fellow officers. The tension between him and some of his colleagues grew as he took a stand for the new direction Captain Lewis was championing. Conversations that once revolved around camaraderie now turned into discussions filled with frustration and skepticism. Despite the challenges, Keller found strength in the relationships he had built with community members. He often joined Amaya and her friends in their youth-led discussions, where they explored the complexities of social justice and community engagement. The young voices reminded him of why this work was essential, reigniting his commitment to the cause. Amaya's leadership blossomed as she organized more events focused on activism and awareness. She rallied her peers to participate in initiatives aimed at educating younger children about their rights and the importance of standing up against injustice. The energy of the youth became a powerful force in the community, motivating others to engage and join the fight for change. Captain Lewis witnessed the transformation taking place around her, both within the community and the police department. The efforts she had spearheaded were beginning to bear fruit, creating spaces for dialogue that had previously been absent. However, she remained acutely aware of the hurdles ahead. To address the internal resistance, Captain Lewis initiated a series of one-on-one conversations with the dissenting officers. She wanted to understand their perspectives, to engage them in meaningful discussions about the changes underway. These meetings were often uncomfortable, filled with tension as she listened to their concerns about the evolving landscape of policing. Through these conversations, Captain Lewis discovered that many officers were grappling with their own fears: fear of losing their identities, fear of being viewed as less competent, and fear of the unknown. With empathy, she sought to reassure them, emphasizing that reform did not equate to weakness, but rather to growth and adaptation. As these dialogues progressed, some officers began to soften, recognizing the need for a new approach to policing. They started to see the benefits of community engagement and the potential for building trust with residents. While not everyone was on board, there was a growing acknowledgement that change was necessary. In the midst of these developments, Keller faced a pivotal moment. He was approached by a journalist interested in sharing his journey of transformation. At first, he hesitated. He had witnessed the media's portrayal of events and was wary of being misunderstood. However, he recognized the importance of sharing his story, not just for himself, but as a testament to the possibility of change. As Keller prepared for the interview, he reflected on the significance of sharing his story. He understood that his experiences could serve as a powerful example of the potential for change within law enforcement. He hoped that by being open about his journey, he could inspire others to confront their own biases and strive for a more just society. When the day of the interview arrived, Keller sat across from the journalist, a mix of nerves and determination coursing through him. He began by recounting his past, his experiences as an officer, the biases he had held, and the pivotal moment that changed everything when he arrested Amaya. Each word felt heavy as he revisited the pain of that day, but he spoke with honesty and vulnerability. The journalist probed deeper, asking about the challenges he faced and reconciling his past with the changes he was now advocating for. Keller shared the struggles he had encountered within the department, the resistance from some colleagues, and the pain of realizing the impact of his actions on the community. He spoke about the internal battles he fought, grappling with guilt and shame, yet also the hope he felt as he engaged with community members and worked toward reform. As the interview progressed, Keller articulated his commitment to change. He emphasized the importance of listening, learning and evolving, not just as a police officer, but as a member of the community. His words resonated with sincerity, reflecting his growth and dedication to creating a better future. When the article was published, it sent shockwaves through the community. Keller's candid account of his transformation sparked discussions about redemption and the possibility of change within the system. Community members responded with a mix of support and skepticism, with some expressing hope that his journey could inspire others, while others remained wary of his motives. Captain Lewis read the article with a sense of pride. She knew that Keller's willingness to be vulnerable was a significant step toward building bridges within the community. While there was still work to be done, this moment marked a turning point, a chance to showcase the potential for positive change in law enforcement. Before we dive into the community's response, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's continue. As the community absorbed the content of the article, reactions poured in from all sides. Many residents expressed their gratitude for Keller's openness, acknowledging that it took courage to confront one's past. They appreciated the transparency and willingness to engage in difficult conversations. For some, it offered a glimmer of hope, a belief that change was possible, even from those who had once perpetuated the very systems they sought to reform. However, skepticism remained, especially among those who had endured the brunt of systemic injustices. Critics voiced concerns that Keller's transformation might be more about public relations than genuine change. Some community members remained wary of his motives, questioning whether he could truly be trusted after the harm he had caused. These mixed feelings highlighted the complexities of the situation, how deep-rooted biases and historical injustices could not be erased by words alone. Captain Lewis recognized the significance of this moment and sought to channel the conversations generated by the article into constructive actions. She organized a community forum where residents could come together to discuss the implications of Keller's journey and the broader issues at play. The event was designed to create an open space for dialogue, allowing community members to voice their concerns and share their perspectives. On the night of the forum, the community center was filled to capacity. Residents gathered, some hopeful, others apprehensive. Keller and Captain Lewis stood together at the front of the room, ready to facilitate the discussion. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, the air thick with anticipation. As the forum began, Captain Lewis welcomed everyone and emphasized the importance of honest dialogue. She invited community members to share their thoughts on Keller's article and the ongoing reform efforts. Voices rang out, expressing a spectrum of emotions, from anger and hurt to cautious optimism. Keller listened intently as residents spoke, his heart heavy with their pain and experiences. He felt the weight of their skepticism and recognized the deep-seated fears that shaped their perspectives. With each story shared, he understood the significance of acknowledging the past while striving for a better future. When it was his turn to speak, Keller shared his gratitude for the opportunity to engage in this dialogue. He addressed the community's concerns directly, acknowledging the skepticism surrounding his journey. He reaffirmed his commitment to reform, emphasizing that he was not asking for forgiveness, but rather seeking to be part of the solution. The forum became a powerful space for healing and connection. As conversations flowed, residents began to share their own stories of resilience and hope. They discussed the importance of community-driven initiatives, emphasizing the need for ongoing collaboration between law enforcement and residents. The dialogue became a catalyst for understanding, breaking down the barriers that had long separated the two sides. As the night wore on, Keller felt a shift in the atmosphere. While not everyone was convinced of his sincerity, there was a growing recognition that change was possible. He left the forum feeling invigorated, determined to continue engaging with the community and working alongside them to foster trust and accountability. Before we explore the ongoing initiatives sparked by this forum and the impact on the relationship between Keller and the community, remember to subscribe and stay engaged with this transformative story of resilience and justice. Now, let's continue. In the aftermath of the community forum, a renewed sense of purpose swept through the town. The conversation sparked by Keller's article and the forum catalyzed a series of initiatives aimed at fostering deeper connections between the police department and residents. Keller and Captain Lewis were determined to harness this momentum to drive meaningful change. One of the first initiatives was the establishment of a community advisory board composed of residents, local leaders, and officers. This board was designed to provide ongoing feedback to the police department, ensuring that community voices were heard in shaping policies and practices. It represented a significant step toward accountability and transparency, reinforcing the idea that the community should have a stake in their policing. Amaya, eager to contribute, joined the advisory board as a youth representative. She felt honored to have a voice in shaping the future of her community, and her involvement invigorated her peers. Together, they organized youth-led initiatives, such as educational workshops focused on understanding rights and responsibilities, ensuring that young people felt empowered and informed. As Keller participated in the advisory board meetings, he witnessed firsthand the impact of community engagement. Residents shared their experiences, their fears, and their hopes for a better future. The conversations were often intense, filled with emotion, but they also offered a space for healing. Keller found himself reflecting on his role within the police department and the importance of humility and empathy in the work he was doing. Captain Lewis also recognized the significance of these initiatives, emphasizing the need for continuous dialogue. She initiated regular town hall meetings where community members could gather to discuss pressing issues, voice concerns, and brainstorm solutions together. The town hall meetings became a platform for collaboration, allowing residents to engage with law enforcement in a constructive manner. As the months rolled on, the changes within the department began to bear fruit. Officers started to attend community events, not just as enforcers of the law, but as active participants. They joined residents in cleanup efforts, attended local festivals, and volunteered in schools. This newfound presence allowed officers to build relationships based on trust and respect, reshaping the narrative surrounding policing in the community. However, challenges still lingered. Despite the progress made, resistance from within the department remained. Some officers continued to push back against the changes, feeling that the new direction compromised their authority. Captain Lewis and Keller knew they had to address these concerns head-on to maintain the momentum they had built. In response, they organized workshops focused on building cultural competency among officers, emphasizing the importance of understanding and respecting the diverse backgrounds of the community they served. These workshops created spaces for officers to engage in honest discussions about their biases and the implications of their actions. Keller often shared his own experiences, hoping to encourage his colleagues to reflect on their own journeys. Amidst the challenges, the community continued to thrive. Amaya, inspired by her involvement in the advisory board, organized a community art project focused on social justice. She rallied her peers to create murals that reflected their stories, hopes, and dreams. The project became a symbol of unity, showcasing the resilience of the community and the power of art as a vehicle for change. As the murals took shape, the community came together, painting alongside officers, engaging in conversations, and sharing laughter. It was a beautiful display of collaboration, a testament to the progress that had been made and the bonds that were forming.